In January 2020, cases of the novel coronavirus started to emerge from and spread in Wuhan province of China. The rate at which it was spreading became a major concern for people living in the province as well as internationally. By March 2020, the coronavirus had been officially flagged as a pandemic, which led to a worldwide shutdown. However, due to the socio-political and economical differences of each country, the response towards the pandemic was very different from each other, which further resulted in varying outcomes. Our research project makes an attempt to conduct a meta-analysis between these prior conditions of different countries in an effort to understand how the conditions affected the approach and results of the pandemic. To better understand the research, we will be presenting four countries: the USA, Armenia, China, and South Korea, and the effectiveness of their response. This will be a preliminary research to confirm the hypothesis. Our hypothesis states that prior conditions of the countries do not affect the result of COVID-19 management conducted by these countries.
Here we show the unaffected countries. Here we show the unaffected countries, which are United States and Armenia. They both have democratic governments, but the United States has a flawed democracy. The United States has a flawed democracy, while Armenia has regular democracy. Population is different. United States has about 330 million, while Armenia has 2.9 million. Population density is also different in that the United States has 300. Population density is also different in that it has 35.7 people per kilometer squared. Armenia has 104.2 people per kilometer squared. The response time was about the same. The United States responded in about 2 weeks, while Armenia took about 3.5 weeks to respond. States and Armenian public approval were a bit different, about 10% more. The United States had 61% support, while Armenia had 71% support. Here we show the death rate versus population density. On the x-axis, we can see population density in 2017, and the y-axis would be the confirmed COVID-19 death per million. You can see Armenia, even though it has much higher population density, had much lower death rate than the United States.
Keeping in mind the higher public approval of Armenia and also a slightly lesser confirmed deaths in Armenia, despite having a much more population density at almost 50 people more per kilometer square, we now come to the stringency index. The stringency index of each country is a measure of how restrictive a country's policies towards COVID-19 were with regards to the policies of other countries. Here, we see that the stringency index of Armenia was almost always more than that of the United States. We see that the stringency index of both the countries rise at about the same time, which means that both of them have had the same response time and the same actions. However, Armenia has conducted those actions much more restrictively. However, when we come to this graph, which shows the confirmed daily cases over the year, we see a big discrepancy. Over here, we see that the graph shows the number of tests done with regards to the number of confirmed cases. The darker a graph is, the more confirmed cases there were. So, United States, having done more cases, had lesser confirmed cases because of the lighter graph, as opposed to Armenia having a dark red graph, which means that more than 20% of the cases done were almost always a confirmed case. This is in stark contrast with what we saw earlier, with more stringent policies and a higher public approval of said policies. Armenia still ended up having more confirmed cases of COVID-19, which directly confirms our hypothesis that the prior conditions do not necessitate the outcome of each country. With that being said, we now move on to the effective countries.
To have a look at the effective countries, we have chosen two countries, China and South Korea. As you can see, China and South Korea have almost the opposite prior conditions. On one hand, China has an authoritarian government, while South Korea has a democratic. China has the world's highest population of 1.4 billion people, with 148 people per kilometer square, while South Korea has meager 51.7 million people, with 515 people per kilometer square. Even with these varied conditions, performed excellent in disaster management. China also was the source country of the coronavirus, leaving it virtually unprepared to fight the pandemic. On the other hand, South Korea had prepared its disaster management efforts after 1 week of detecting the first case. These countries had a great public approval, with China having 73% support and South Korea having 65% support.
Here again is a stringency graph showing the strength of the countries' respective responses, South Korea being in green and China in red. You can see a difference between the response efforts of South Korea and China, China having a prolonged response with strong restrictions at about an 80, and South Korea having a strong initial response and decreasing the response after some time. Even though South Korea and China had a difference in the level of stringency for the response effort, we can see very similar results in their effectiveness, the death per population density being very similarly low for the two countries. This in comparison to Armenia and the United States had relatively high levels. This shows that the effectiveness of a response is not solely based on its stringency.
To understand this, we'll be referring to a research conducted by the Lowy Institute, where Lowy Institute had scored each country according to the stringency efforts and the outcomes of the pandemic in the specific country. Here, this is a graph showing the Lowy Institute score each country had got over the weeks after their 100th case was discovered. So we can see that China and South Korea have always had a very high score, with China ending close to 100 and South Korea having a little over 70. On the other hand, United States has a pretty low score throughout the period examined, with ending with a score of around 22. This shows how the countries South Korea and China had a great COVID-19 disaster management, while United States has a very poor one.
This preliminary research, primarily using data from our World in Data and the Lowy Institute, one can see that you can have similar levels of effectiveness regardless of the differences relating to the response effort's stringency. Both China and Armenia had a very strong response with different effects. South Korea and America had weaker responses with different effects. In relation to our hypothesis, we think that the conditions a country is in prior to it being in the pandemic will change the effectiveness of their relative responses. If this is true, then we would need to find ways to tailor a country's response to their respective situations. To continue testing this, we would like to research more countries. For example, there were countries like Sweden that assumed that it could have less stringent policies due to its low population density, which we could potentially include in our analysis. There were also countries like New Zealand being seen as a generally effective model for a response effort, but we could see to what extent its prior conditions impacted their effective COVID response, and whether it could truly be seen as a universal overall response. Overall, the goal would be to make a more effective and accurate COVID response for different countries.
The sources that we chose for this research were Lowy Institute and our World in Data. With that being said, I would like to take a moment and thank all the members, including myself, who contributed to this research. So that's Kush, me, Ishan, Frank, and Jared. And we would also like to thank you for listening to our presentation.